The snow had not yet come to Blue Ridge Valley when Harriet Vance first climbed the hill, but the air already carried the particular sharpness of a Virginia autumn that had made up its mind. September light fell flat across the ridgeline, the kind of light that illuminates without warming, and the grass along the path had gone the color of old straw. She walked with a canvas bag over one shoulder, a cast-iron pot hanging from her left hand, and a folded sheet of paper tucked inside her coat against her sternum, where it pressed against her ribs with every breath like something that intended to stay. The path was more suggestion than fact. Deer had made it probably, or something older than deer. It switched back twice before leveling onto a shelf of exposed limestone that jutted from the hillside like a lower jaw. The mouth of the cave opened behind it, wide, dark, taller than she expected. She stopped at the threshold and did not go in immediately. She stood with the pot hanging from her hand and looked at the opening the way a person looks at a door that belongs to someone else. Then she stepped inside. The cold she anticipated did not arrive. The air within was not warm by any definition that would have satisfied a woman accustomed to a proper hearth, but it was not the damp bite she had braced herself against. It was simply still. Neutral in the way that deep cellars are neutral or old churches before the congregation fills them. She set the pot on the ground and pressed her palm flat against the limestone wall to her left. The rock was not cold. She held her hand there, counting her heartbeats the way her mother had once taught her to measure time without a watch: 1 beat, 2 beats, 3, and the stone held its temperature steadily, neither drawing heat from her skin nor offering any. It simply maintained. She pulled her hand away, looked at her palm as though it might have changed, then looked at the cave. Wide at the mouth, yes, too wide. She could already feel the way the wind would move through when it had somewhere it wanted to be. But the cave did not run straight. It bent perhaps 20 feet in curving left into a narrower passage that disappeared into darkness. She had not noticed that from outside. Most people would not have looked long enough to notice it. Harriet Vance had always been the kind of woman who looked long enough. She had been a school teacher in Chillicothe, Ohio for 14 years before the accident, and before the accident meant before James, which meant before Virginia, which meant before everything that had led her to this particular hillside on this particular afternoon with a cast-iron pot and 5 acres of limestone and a document signed by Douglas Vance that she had not yet read all the way through because the first 2 paragraphs had been sufficient to understand what was being given and why. She had been 33 when she married James, old enough that people had stopped expecting it, and she had loved him in the practical, attentive way of someone who understood that love was less a feeling than a practice. When he died in the mill accident in 1881, the feeling and the practice both stopped at once, and she was left in a county where she had no family, no property in her name, and a brother-in-law who was legally entitled to everything James had owned, which had not been much, but which had included the roof over her head. Douglas Vance was not a cruel man. That was the part that had taken her longest to absorb. Cruelty, she could have worked with cruelty, has edges you can find in the dark. Douglas operated at a temperature too moderate for cruelty, too self-interested for generosity. He was the kind of man who found arrangements that suited him and called them fair. The arrangement he found in August of 1882 was this: 5 acres of hillside, a cave, and a document that absolved him of anything that came after. He stood in the doorway of the lawyer's office on Market Street and handed her the paper without meeting her eyes, his expression carrying the practiced neutrality of a man completing a transaction he had already narrated to himself as charitable. "No one can say we turned you out." His voice had the weight of a line rehearsed. Cecilia stood behind him in the hallway, hands folded in front of her coat. She was 49, a woman who had arranged her face so long into careful pleasantness that the pleasantness had calcified into something that was no longer pleasant, but merely fixed. She did not speak. Her eyes moved to the window. Harriet took the paper. She did not thank them. She did not say anything at all. She read the first 2 paragraphs, understood the outline, folded the document, and put it inside her coat. She was almost to the street door when Cecilia called her name quietly, the way a person calls across a room when they do not want to be overheard from the hallway. Harriet stopped, but did not turn all the way around. She heard the quick, soft sound of Cecilia's heels on the wood floor, and then something was being pressed into her hand, a small square of cloth folded over on itself, twice tied with a piece of kitchen twine. Cecilia said nothing. When Harriet turned fully, Cecilia was already moving back toward Douglas, her expression rearranged into its usual neutrality, as though the 10 seconds had not occurred. Outside alone on Market Street, with the parcel in her hand, Harriet untied the twine. Inside the cloth, a small paper envelope of seeds, winter cress. She would determine later the kind that could germinate even in near-frost conditions. And beneath the seeds, a piece of paper folded twice in handwriting that was clearly Cecilia's, narrow and controlled. She read it standing on the sidewalk with wagon traffic moving past her. The note said, "There is a spring on the north face of the hill below the second outcropping. It does not freeze. Douglas knows about it. Silas Calloway told him 30 years ago." Below that, in smaller letters pressed harder into the paper as though written faster, or with more urgency, Douglas knew about this cave before he transferred it. He chose to give it to you because it was better than nothing. He does not understand yet that better than nothing can become everything, if the person receiving it knows what to do with what they have been given. She had stood there long enough that a man with a barrel cart had to move around her. Then she put the note inside her coat with the land document, picked up her bag, and began the walk to the livery stable to retrieve the few things she had stored there. That was 6 weeks ago. Now she stood in the cave with her pot on the ground and the September light falling through the entrance behind her, and she walked to the interior bend to see how far it went. It went far enough. The passage narrowed to perhaps 8 feet wide, close enough that the wind from the entrance would lose its authority before it reached this point, and deepened into a chamber roughly 20 feet across the ceiling, rising and then leveling at about 10 feet. The walls here were smoother shaped by older water that had long since gone elsewhere. The floor was flat limestone, uneven in the way that natural things are uneven, but flat enough to sleep on if you warmed the stone first. She stood in the interior chamber and measured it with her eyes, the way she had once measured classroom dimensions before deciding where to place the desks. Square footage was a habit of mind she had never outgrown. The outer passage could serve as a windbreak if she built a wall at the bend. The interior chamber could be made livable if she could solve the heating problem, the moisture problem, the food storage problem, and the problem of being a woman alone on a hillside in a county where she knew almost no one. 4 problems. She had solved harder things with fewer resources. She walked back to the entrance, picked up her pot, and started down the hill to begin. The first wall took her 11 days and fell on the 12th. She had used greenwood pine because it was the easiest to find and cut and packed the gaps with fresh moss because moss was abundant. The structure was not inelegant. The problem was thermal expansion. As the wood dried in the fluctuating temperature near the cave entrance, the logs shifted, the moss compressed and crumbled out of the gaps. And on the morning of the 12th day, she came around the bend to find the wall had given way at the bottom right corner and lay in a neat diagonal collapse across the passage floor. She stood looking at it for a while. It was early October by then, and the light had changed again, lower, more golden, the kind of light that makes the world look finished. Her hands were cracked across the knuckles from the work, and the 4th finger of her right hand had a cut across the first joint that had healed improperly and would leave a small ridge of scar she would carry for the rest of her life. She pulled the fallen logs aside and started again. The second wall used oak, heavier by at least half, which meant each log required her full weight to shift, which meant she spent 2 days simply moving material before she could begin building. She used dry moss this time, gathered from the north face of the boulders below the cave, where it had desiccated in the summer heat and retained its insulating properties without the expansion problem. She chinked each gap twice, pressing the moss in with a flat stick before adding a second layer. Her fingers split in new places. She kept working. By the 3rd week of October, the wall stood. Not beautiful, she was not building for beauty, but solid. She pushed against it with her full weight and it did not move. She pushed again. Nothing. The heating problem revealed its own solution gradually, the way most real solutions do not, as an insight but as an accumulation of small observations. The first observation was the one she had made on the first day that the rock itself held temperature. The second observation came on a cold night in mid-October when she built a fire in the interior chamber and found that by morning the walls had absorbed enough heat to maintain the chamber at a survivable temperature even after the fire had died to coals. The third observation came from a mistake one afternoon. She built the fire too close to the chamber wall and the rock became uncomfortably hot to the touch, and she noticed that the heat radiated for hours after she moved the fire away. Limestone, she would understand eventually, had a thermal mass that wood and plaster did not. It received heat slowly and surrendered it slowly. It was in its patient way more reliable than any hearth she had ever used. The exterior hearth took her 4 days to construct from flat stones she carried up from the creek bed in her canvas bag, 3 and 4 at a time. She built it in the curved alcove just outside the cave entrance, positioned so that the prevailing wind would carry heat inward rather than away. Something she worked out by spending an afternoon with a strip of cloth tied to a stick, watching which direction it moved at different points around the entrance. Cecilia had told her about the spring. Nobody had told her about the wind. She worked that out herself. The spring was exactly where the note had indicated below the second limestone outcropping on the north face of the hill. It was small, barely more than a seep coming from a crack in the rock face, but it ran consistently, and when the first hard freeze came in late October, the spring continued flowing while the standing water in the creek bed below went still. She did not yet understand why it did not freeze. She understood only that it did not, and that this was the difference between surviving winter and not surviving it. She hauled water up in 2 tin pails every morning, a task that added an hour to her day and gave her arms a steadiness she had not previously possessed. Her body was changing in ways she noticed without particular feeling. Harder across the shoulders, steadier in the legs. Her hands now almost unrecognizable to her, as the hands that had once graded arithmetic papers in a warm schoolroom in Ohio. She thought about Ohio sometimes not with longing exactly, but with the particular attention one gives to a life that has been definitively ended. Chillicothe, the school, the smell of chalk dust and wood smoke in the morning. She could reconstruct it precisely and feel almost nothing about it, which told her that whatever grief she had carried for that life had already been worked through somewhere in the process of building walls and hauling water without her noticing. She thought about James less than she expected. When she did, it was always the same image, not his face, but his hands, large, competent hands that knew how to hold a tool and how to hold a woman's face, and how to do both with the same quality of attention. She missed the attention more than she missed the man, and she understood that this was not a diminishment of what they had had, but an accurate description of what she had lost. By November, the cave had become something that could reasonably be called habitable. The wall stood. The interior chamber held heat through the night. The limestone shelves that jutted naturally from the interior walls now held 2 months' worth of stored food. Dried beans in sealed tins, smoked meat wrapped in cloth, a sack of cornmeal she had carried up in portions over 3 separate trips, preserves she had put up in October from the late-season apples on the 2 trees she had found on the eastern slope of the hill. The spring ran. The wall held. The valley had watched the construction with the particular attention that small communities give to spectacles they expect to conclude unsatisfactorily. Men on the lower road slowed their horses. Women with market baskets shielded their eyes and looked up the hill and looked away again. In October, Nora Pruitt had climbed the slope, a sturdy woman in her mid-40s, who was known in the valley for the precision of her opinions, and stood with her arms crossed at the cave entrance, while Harriet stirred a pot of dried beans over the exterior hearth. A cave is still a cave. Nora's voice had the quality of a statement that had already considered and dismissed all counter-arguments. Harriet did not look up from the pot. It keeps what it's given. Nora had stood there for a moment longer, the moment of a person waiting to see if there was more, and then descended the hill apparently satisfied that she had said the necessary thing. Harriet had watched her go and felt nothing that resembled triumph. What she felt was closer to patience, the specific patience of someone who has been told the tide will defeat them and has decided to simply keep building until the tide provides evidence of its own position. The night Harriet Vance nearly left was a Tuesday in the second week of November. She had not kept a precise calendar. There seemed little reason to in a life organized entirely by daylight and weather, but she was fairly certain it was a Tuesday because she had hauled water that morning, and she hauled water every Monday and Thursday, and her arms had the particular deep ache of the day after heavy work, rather than the day of it. Which meant Monday had passed, which meant the night in question was Tuesday. It began with an ice storm. Not snow ice, which is different and worse because ice does not soften the world but encases it. The sleet came laterally from the northwest and hit the cave wall like thrown gravel, and the sound of it against the logs was not peaceful. She had built a fire in the interior chamber early, and built it large, and by nightfall the chamber was warm enough. But at some point in the middle hours of the night, the fire died. She did not know when it happened she had been asleep. She woke to darkness and a cold that had not yet reached dangerous, but was moving in that direction with clear intent. She found the coals and spent 20 minutes trying to coax a flame from kindling that had absorbed enough ambient moisture to be uncooperative. The fire caught twice and died twice. On the third attempt, it held but low, and she sat beside it in both her coats, with her knees pulled up, and watched the small flame, and did the arithmetic. She had approximately 4 months of food. She had heat as long as she had wood, and wood as long as she could cut and haul it, and she could cut and haul it as long as her hands stayed functional and the slope stayed navigable. She had water from the spring. She had solved one by one the 4 problems she had named to herself on the first day. What she had not solved, what she could not solve with walls and water and thermal mass, was the problem of a life that had been reduced to its own survival. She was 38 years old. She had been a teacher. She had read Thoreau and Darwin and had opinions about both. She had spent 14 years explaining the mechanics of long division and the causes of the war between the states to children who would carry those explanations into adulthood, and sometimes she hoped use them. She had done none of that in 2 months. She had chinked walls and hauled water and learned the thermal properties of limestone, and she was alive and she was alone, and the ice was coming sideways off the northwest, and the fire kept dying. She pulled her extra pair of wool socks from the bag near the wall and began to put them on. Not as a decision, as a preparation for a decision she had not yet made consciously. The socks went on. She reached for her boots. She found the laces and pulled them toward her and began to thread the first one through its eyelets. She was going to go to Pittsburgh. The thought arrived not as something new, but as something that had been present for weeks, waiting for conditions to make it visible. Pittsburgh was 4 days by wagon if the roads were clear, which they would not be, so perhaps a week, perhaps longer. But Pittsburgh was a city, and cities had schools, and schools needed teachers, and she had 14 years of experience and references from the Chillicothe district that she had kept in the tin box under the sleeping platform because she had not been able to make herself leave them behind, even when she had left almost everything else. She had threaded the first bootlace through 4 eyelets. Her hand, in the process of reaching for the 5th, found the limestone wall. She had not meant to touch it. She was leaning toward the boot, and the wall was simply there, and her palm came flat against it the way a person's hand finds a railing in the dark. The stone was warm, not warm like a hearthstone or a heated brick, warm like something that had absorbed heat hours ago and had not yet decided to release it. The fire had been dead long enough for the chamber to cool 10–15 degrees. The rock was still warm. She stopped threading the boot. She pressed her palm harder against the limestone and felt the heat moving from the stone into her skin, a slow, patient transfer in the direction of the cold, which was her hand, which was her. The rock was giving something back. It had been given heat, and it was returning heat steadily without drama at its own pace. Harriet sat with her hand against the wall for a long time. She was not thinking about Pittsburgh anymore. She was thinking about the mechanism. Thermal mass, the capacity of a material to absorb and store heat energy. She had known this as a principle since she had studied natural philosophy at the normal school in Columbus. She had never lived inside the principle before. She had never understood in the way that the body understands things that the mind only knows. That a material's response to heat was not immediate, but delayed, that it took time, and that the delay was not a flaw, but a feature that you could charge it like a battery and draw from it like a battery, and that limestone, specifically with its density and its composition, was better at this than almost anything else a person might find on the surface of the earth. She pulled her hand away from the wall and looked at the boot in her lap. The lace hung from 4 eyelets. She set the boot down without threading the 5th. She did not make a speech to herself about staying. She did not decide in any conscious sense that she would have been able to describe to someone else. She simply did not finish putting the boot on. She fed the fire instead. Smaller logs first built up carefully, and when it was burning steadily, she lay down on the warm stone floor in both coats and the wool socks and listened to the ice against the wall until she fell asleep. In the morning, she walked out through the exterior alcove into a world encased in glass. Every surface had a skin of ice half an inch thick. The rocks, the bare branches of the hickory trees on the slope, the logs of her wall. The valley below was perfectly still and perfectly white and perfectly beautiful in the way that things are sometimes beautiful precisely because they are dangerous. Next to the cave entrance, placed flush against the wall in the shelter of the alcove, was a bundle of firewood. 8 or 9 pieces of split oak stacked with the care of someone who understood that wood stacked neatly sheds weather better than wood stacked casually. The bundle had been there long enough for the ice storm to have glazed the top piece, which meant it had been placed during the night before the storm ended. Someone had climbed the hill in an ice storm in the dark and left her wood. She stood looking at the bundle for a long time. There were no footprints, the ice had covered everything, but the ice over the top piece of wood was thinner than the ice on the surrounding rocks, which told her the wood had arrived after the worst of the storm rather than at its beginning. Sometime in the early hours then, not quite full dark. She picked up the top piece of wood and examined it. Split clean the grain of the oak running straight. Someone who knew how to split wood. She carried the bundle inside and added 2 pieces to the fire. December came in gray and final. The valley contracted into itself the way valleys do in December, the distances shortening as the trees went bare and the light went flat, everything becoming a matter of near and nearer. She could see the Vance farmhouse from the cave entrance, now that the leaves were gone a quarter-mile down, and to the south the white clapboard stark against the brown fields. The chimney put up smoke in the mornings and evenings with the regularity of something maintained by habit rather than attention, the smoke rising straight when the air was still and bending south when the wind came from the north. She watched it without feeling much. Douglas and Cecilia Vance continued their lives below with no apparent awareness that she was watching or any apparent concern for what was happening on the hill above their land. This suited her. She did not want their concern. She wanted their absence, which they were providing consistently. Nora Pruitt came a second time in early December alone and stood at the cave entrance with her hands in her coat pockets. The wall was complete by then, the exterior hearth blackened and seasoned, the smoke of the cooking fire rising from the alcove in a thin, steady line. Nora looked at all of it with the expression of someone updating a previous calculation. "You're still here." Not an accusation, not a compliment, an observation made with some surprise. "I am." Harriet was splitting kindling at the alcove and did not stop. Nora stood there longer than she had in October. She looked at the wall, at the hearth, at the wood stacked in the shelter of the alcove's overhang. Her hands stayed in her pockets. "The Callaway boy brings you wood," she said finally. The phrasing was careful, almost neutral in the way of information offered without a clear reason for the offering. Harriet drove the hatchet into a piece of pine and left it there. She looked at Nora. "Young Thomas Callaway," Nora said. "Robert Callaway's boy, 16. A pause. "His father doesn't know." Harriet said nothing, waiting. "I've seen him on the hill twice." Nora's voice was neither approving nor disapproving. It was simply factual, which in a woman of Nora's calibration meant she had decided the information mattered. "He's a good boy." She let that sit. "Better judgment than most twice his age." She left after that, walking down the hill with her hands still in her pockets, and Harriet stood in the alcove for a moment after she had disappeared into the tree line, thinking about a 16-year-old boy who had climbed a hill in an ice storm at 2 in the morning to leave firewood for a woman he did not know. She retrieved the hatchet and resumed splitting. By the last week of December, the valley had stopped looking up at the hill entirely. They had waited for November to defeat her, and November had not. They had waited for December, and December had not. The waiting had become inconvenient, and so they had replaced it with an assumption that she was there, that she was surviving at some minimal level, and that January would finish what the previous months had failed to start. This assumption was comfortable and required nothing of them. Harriet was aware of the assumption, the way she was aware of the weather, as a fact of the environment that did not require her response. She went on doing what she had been doing. She hauled water. She split wood. She maintained the wall. She heated the interior chamber each evening and rose each morning to find the walls still warm, the springs still running, the valley still below her. On Christmas Day, she ate a bowl of cornmeal mush with a spoonful of apple preserve and sat in the cave entrance and looked at the valley and the far ridge beyond it, and the sky above the ridge, which was the particular blue of winter sky in Virginia, deep and cold and utterly indifferent, the blue of something that has been itself for a very long time and intends to continue. She was not happy. She did not think happiness was the right category. She was something for which she did not have a precise word, something adjacent to competence, to adequacy, in the most literal sense, the state of being adequate to what was required of her. She had been required to survive, and she had been adequate to that requirement, and the limestone walls held their heat around her, and the spring ran on the north face of the hill, and the valley waited below for January to arrive and prove its point. She finished the cornmeal. She washed the bowl with water from the pail. She picked up her hatchet and went to split the afternoon's wood. January was coming. She intended to be ready for it. January arrived without announcement, the way serious things often do. No single morning felt different from the last morning of December. The same iron sky, the same bare ridgeline, the same smoke rising from the farmhouse chimney below. But the cold that came in the first week of the new year had a different quality than the cold of autumn. Autumn cold is tentative testing. January cold in the Blue Ridge had made its decision. It arrived with the certainty of something that had no interest in negotiation. Harriet had prepared for it the way she prepared for everything methodically without drama, by solving each component problem in sequence. The wood was stacked deep in the alcove 3 weeks worth by her calculation, which she had then extended to 4 weeks by cutting an additional 2 days beyond what she thought she needed, because she had learned that her calculations about what she needed were consistently optimistic by 15%. The cornmeal sack was half full. The beans were sealed. The smoked meat was wrapped in 2 layers of cloth. The spring ran. The wall stood. What she had not prepared for, because there was no preparing for it, was the storm that began on the 11th of January. She knew it was coming before it arrived the way the limestone knew things before she did. The rock face on the north side of the hill had been seeping more than usual for 2 days, a phenomenon she had come to understand meant pressure changes in the water table, which meant significant weather moving through the region. The birds had gone quiet. The creek below had developed a metallic sound she had not heard before, the particular resonance of water moving fast under a skin of forming ice. She brought an extra day's worth of wood inside the passage and filled both water pails to the brim. The snow began mid-morning, which was deceptive. Morning snow in Virginia often burned off or softened by afternoon. She watched it from the cave entrance for an hour, assessing before she understood that this was not that kind of snow. The flakes were not the large, lazy flakes of a moderating storm. They were small, dense, granular, the kind that accumulate faster than they appear to be accumulating, because each flake is heavier than it looks. By noon, the exterior alcove had an inch. By mid-afternoon, 4 inches. She built the exterior fire and let it run hot, heating the limestone mass of the interior walls against what was coming, then banked it carefully and moved inside. By the time darkness came on the first evening, the snow was driving sideways off the northeast, and the sound against the log wall had changed from a whisper to something more insistent. She ate beans, tended the small interior fire, pressed her palm to the wall at regular intervals, the way a doctor checks a patient's forehead. The rock was warm. She slept. The second day, the storm did not relent. She opened the cave entrance to measure the drift and found it had reached the top of the exterior alcove wall overnight, roughly 4 feet of compacted snow in the sheltered space, which meant the open hillside had accumulated more. She could not see the lower road. She could not see the fence lines. The valley had been erased, replaced by a white uniformity that made distance meaningless. And the snow was still falling with the patience of something that had no reason to stop. She assessed her situation with the attention she gave everything wood for at least 3 weeks. Food for 6 water from the interior pail she had brought in before the drift sealed the entrance. Heat holding, wall holding. She was by any practical measure safe. The storm was doing exactly what she had prepared for it to do, which was to be serious. She spent the second day in tasks that required no outdoor access. She mended the hem of her heavier coat, respliced the frayed end of her water rope, used a flat piece of limestone as a surface to work out a geometry problem. She had been turning over in her mind for 2 weeks regarding the optimal angle for a secondary windbreak. She was considering adding to the exterior alcove. She ate a measured meal at midday. She read 3 chapters of the Darwin she had carried up before the transfer, the only book she had brought because it was the one she could not leave, because it was the one that had taught her the thing she needed most in the cave. That survival is not a matter of strength, but of fit of learning, the precise shape of your environment well enough to occupy it without waste. On the afternoon of the second day, she went to the cave entrance and looked through the narrow gap she had kept clear with the door bar. The valley was still erased, but the farmhouse was visible, barely a dark mass in the white distance, because the surrounding fields were flat enough that even in heavy snowfall, the outline of the structure was legible. The chimney was not producing smoke. She stood at the gap for a long time looking at this. The Vance farmhouse chimney had been one of the reliable features of her daily landscape since September morning. Smoke, evening smoke, the steady evidence of a maintained fire in a maintained house. She had watched it the way sailors watch lighthouses, not because she needed it, but because its consistency had been a kind of background fact about the world she occupied. Now the chimney stood black against the white sky, and the absence of smoke was so complete, so total, that it had the quality of a statement rather than an oversight. She went to the sleeping platform and retrieved the small brass field glass that had been James's, one of the few objects she had taken from the farmhouse before Douglas formalized the transfer, because it had been James's father's, and James had carried it in his coat pocket for years, and she could not prove it was legally hers, but she had taken it anyway, a decision she had made without deliberation and had not reconsidered. She extended the glass and put it to the gap in the entrance. The farmhouse's first-floor windows were dark. The porch had drifted to the rail. The south door, which was the door most protected from prevailing weather, had a drift against it that reached the door handle, meaning it had not been opened from inside in at least a day, possibly longer, because the storm had been producing new snow continuously. The second-floor window on the east face of the house had a faint glow. Not lamplight, too weak, too unsteady. Candle. She held the glass to her eye for a long time, watching the candle glow waver in the second-floor window, and she understood what she was looking at. The farmhouse had a central staircase positioned adjacent to the main hearth. She knew the floor plan because she had lived in the house for 3 years. If the main hearth on the first floor had gone out, and the first floor doors had drifted shut from outside, and the storm had been running for 2 days, the people inside that house had retreated upward to the second floor, where there was no hearth, only a small iron stove in the master bedroom that required its own wood supply, wood that would have been stored on the first floor. A candle meant they had light. A candle did not mean they had heat. Douglas Vance was 54 years old. Cecilia was 49. Neither of them had spent significant time in serious cold. They had lived in a maintained house for decades with wood brought by hired hands, with a hearth that had never failed in 30 years of marriage. Neither of them knew what she knew, which was how fast the cold moves when there is nothing between you and it. She put down the field glass. She looked at the entrance gap, at the drift beyond it, at the white wall of still falling snow. She did not spend long in the making of this decision. The deliberation she had imagined, the weighing of what these people had done against what they now required, did not materialize in any meaningful form. What she had was not forgiveness exactly. It was something more structural than forgiveness. The understanding that the arithmetic of survival did not operate on the basis of what people deserved. Douglas Vance had arranged her disposal with the efficiency of a man clearing a line item from a ledger. This was true. It was also true that he was in a house with no working heat, in a storm that had not yet decided to stop, and that he was 54 years old, and that 54-year-old men in serious cold did not always make it to the decision to go for help before the cold made the decision for them. She was already moving before she had finished the thought. She dressed in all available layers, both coats, the extra socks, the scarf worn twice. She found the heavy canvas work gloves and put them on, then covered them with the wool mittens. She retrieved the mattock from its hook on the interior wall, the tool with the long handle she had used throughout the fall for breaking frozen ground and moving large stones. The handle would work as a probe for depth checking in heavy snow. She opened the entrance. The drift that had built against the cave wall over 2 days came to her shoulder. She drove the mattock handle into it, testing packed snow firm, not the looser drift she had hoped for. She would have to cut through it rather than push through it. She began. The work of moving through 8 feet of packed snow over a downhill distance of 300 yards took the next 2 hours. She was not fast. She was not meant to be fast. She had learned in 4 months on the hill that speed was the enemy of accuracy, and accuracy was the only thing between her and a broken ankle in a hidden rock hollow, or a wrong line that would take her past the fence line and into the open field where the snow depth was unknown. She drove the mattock handle into the snow ahead of each step, listening for the difference in resonance between solid ground and hollow, between packed drift and air pocket. Wood gave a flat sound. Rock gave a sharp one. She followed the sound of rock, which was the sound of the hillside she knew. The cold took her fingers first, working from the tips inward, reaching the second knuckle of each finger by the time she was halfway down. She stopped twice to work her hands inside the mittens, curling the fingers hard and releasing them, driving blood back into the periphery. The second time she stopped, she could not feel the third and fourth fingers of her left hand at all, and spent an additional 30 seconds with her left fist pressed into the space between her coat layers, against her side, before sensation returned enough to continue. She did not allow herself to think about what was happening to Douglas Vance's hands in an unheated second-floor room. The farmhouse materialized out of the white. First the roof line, then the second-story window, where the candle still burned, then the porch rail buried to its crossbar. She found the south door by memory rather than sight, driving the mattock handle along the wall until it found the doorframe. The drift against the door was compacted. She used the mattock blade to break it in sections, working from the top down, clearing enough to reach the latch in approximately 20 minutes. Her shoulders burned. She kept moving. She knocked once. The sound of it was small against the size of the storm. Nothing for a long time. She knocked again, harder, the heel of her fist against the wood. A sound from inside, not footsteps, something slower. A shuffle, a pause, a shuffle. The latch moved from the inside, stopped, moved again, and the door opened inward by inches. Cecilia stood in the opening. She was wearing everything she owned, as near as Harriet could determine, 2 coats layered over what appeared to be a dress and 2 additional wool overskirts. Her hair unbound her face, the particular gray-white of serious cold. Her breath came in visible pulses in the unheated air of the hallway. Behind her, the house smelled of cold ash, damp wool, the Swedish odor of 2 people who had been cold for a long time. "You're coming with me." Harriet's voice was steady, not a question. Cecilia did not argue. She turned back into the house. Near the staircase, visible from the door, 2 small bundles sat tied and waiting on the bottom step, packed before Harriet's arrival, packed in the expectation of something of someone. Harriet looked at those bundles and understood that Cecilia had known or hoped, or both. Cecilia was already lifting them. Douglas was in the sitting room, upright in the chair nearest the dead hearth, positioned there, with the stubbornness of a man who has decided that moving means admitting something. His beard had collected a fine rime of frost from his own exhaled breath. He looked at Harriet with an expression that passed through several phases too quickly to name surprise, then something that was not quite shame, then a kind of stripped attention, as though the cold had removed whatever buffer usually stood between his face and what was happening behind it. His jaw tightened as the situation settled in him. She watched him try to stand without assistance. His knees shook once, a single involuntary tremor that ran through both legs simultaneously before they locked. He did not accept a hand. He steadied himself by degrees, one hand on the chair arm weight, transferring forward legs, finding their authority, and then he stepped toward the door. She did not praise this. She turned back to the entrance and began cutting the return path. The climb back was longer than the descent, not only because of the incline, but because of what she was carrying, the weight of 2 people who had not moved significantly in 2 days, who were underfed and poorly warmed, and were now asking bodies that had been conserving everything to produce effort on demand. Cecilia managed without instruction, her right hand wrapped in the rope Harriet had tied between them, her left hand under Douglas's elbow. Douglas fell once on the steepest section, a clean fall, both knees no sound, and took a moment on the ground before rising. He did not look at Harriet when he stood again. He nodded once at the slope as if acknowledging an opponent. The snow was still falling. The path she had cut on the way down was already softening at the edges, filling in from the sides with the slow democratic persistence of snow that takes no instruction. She drove the mattock ahead of each step with the same rhythm she had used on the descent, and the rhythm was the thing, not the cold, not the burning in her shoulders, not the 300 yards that kept failing to shorten. The rhythm was the only fact that mattered. When the wall of the cave appeared through the last of the hemlock trees, Douglas stopped. He stood in the snow, both feet planted, and looked at what she had built. The wall was not what he had imagined. She understood this from the way he looked at it. The slight recalibration in his expression, the shift from whatever picture he had been carrying to the thing that actually existed. Stacked oak, chinked with dry moss, fitted at the corners with the patience of someone who had figured it out by failing first. The exterior alcove was intact, the hearthstones blackened, the remaining wood stack visible in the shelter, the smoke line thin and steady, still rising. Cecilia placed her hand on his sleeve. He did not move immediately. Then he did. Inside, the warmth was not dramatic. It was not the blast of a heated room. It was a sustained temperature held at the level that a well-managed body could maintain without expenditure. And after 2 days in a house that had been slowly equalizing with the outside world, the difference was total. Cecilia went down on one knee at the entrance, not falling, but choosing to be closer to the ground for a moment. Her hand pressed flat on the limestone floor, which was warmer than the air by several degrees. Douglas crossed to the south wall and placed his palm against the rock. He held it there. His eyes were open but not focused on anything in the room. He was feeling the temperature the way she had felt it on the first day, that patient warmth, that slow release of what had been stored. He stood with his hand on the limestone for a long time, and Harriet watched him understand something, though she could not have said precisely what. She heated the 3 tin cups she had. Cornmeal mush thinned with spring water to make it go further, seasoned with salt. She handed one to Cecilia, one to Douglas. His hand shook when he lifted the cup, a fine tremor across all the fingers, but he did not spill. He drank. The color began to come back into Cecilia's face by degrees, a slow return from gray to something living. That night the storm renewed. The wind rose after dark and drove the snow against the log wall with a sound like thrown sand, and the valley below was lost in it. Inside the cave, the warmth held at its steady level, the limestone releasing what it had stored over days of careful heating, the interior temperature varying by perhaps 3 degrees across the night. Harriet slept in her usual position near the interior wall. Cecilia and Douglas slept on the platform she had built against the east face, under the quilt she had stored in the natural overhang above the second limestone shelf. The second day, Douglas tried to rise and move toward the entrance. Harriet put her hand on his sleeve, the same gesture Cecilia had used on the hill. She realized, though, the intention was different. Not yet. His mouth tightened. He returned to the platform without a word. On the second evening, while Douglas slept with the even breathing of a man whose body had finally been persuaded to stop fighting, Cecilia sat near the small interior fire. Harriet was adding wood in the careful, measured way she had practiced for months. Small pieces first fed at intervals, rather than all at once, maintaining a steady temperature rather than chasing it up and down. "I thought you would be gone before November." Cecilia's voice was low, aimed at the fire rather than at Harriet. Harriet fed another piece of wood. "Most people did. We gave you that hillside because we believed it would send you away." A pause. "Back to Ohio. Back to wherever you might have gone." Another pause longer. "We wanted you gone without having to say so." Harriet said nothing. The fire was the only sound between them. Cecilia's hands were in her lap, folded, unfolded, folded again. "I told myself it was better than nothing. That 5 acres was better than nothing." Her voice carried the particular quality of a person who has been rehearsing an argument and has recently lost faith in it. "I believed that for a while." Harriet turned from the fire and looked at her. Cecilia met her eyes. "I was wrong." The words came stiffly, moving through a passage that had not been much used. "About what we gave you. About what you would do with it." She looked at the limestone wall above the fire, at the way the light moved in the grain of the rock. "About you." It was not an apology in any form that a lawyer would recognize. It was something smaller than an apology, but in certain ways more precise. An acknowledgement without theater, offered not to relieve its speaker, but to correct a record that had been wrong too long. Harriet turned back to the fire. She fed one more piece of wood, placed with the same care as all the others. On the third morning, the storm stopped. The silence was so complete after 2 days of continuous sound that it had a physical quality, like a change in air pressure. Harriet walked to the entrance and stood in the gap, looking out at a world remade. The drift in the alcove had reached the top of the exterior wall. Beyond it, the hillside was unreadable. No paths, no fence lines, no gradients. Only the long white slope running down to a valley that had also been erased and was now simply the absence of the ridge. She raised the field glass. The farmhouse chimney was still cold. She turned back inside. On the sleeping platform, Douglas was awake, sitting upright, watching her with an expression that had lost several of its usual layers. He was not less himself. He was, if anything, more himself than she had seen before. Stripped of the arrangements people build around themselves over decades of moving through the world as they intend to move through it. He looked like a man who had been carrying a version of himself for a long time and had put it down. "The chimney will need cleaning before you relight," she said. "The cold could have cracked the flue liner. Light a small fire first and watch the draw." He looked at her without speaking for a moment. Then, with the precision of someone who has decided to say the thing rather than the easier adjacent thing, "If I had understood what you were going to build up here—" He stopped, started differently. "I did not think you would stay long enough to learn this place." "I know." Something moved through his expression, not guilt, which is about the self, but recognition, which is about the other person. "You knew the first week," he said. "I knew the first day." She held his gaze. "That's different from knowing what to do about it." He was quiet for a while. Outside, the silence of the post-storm valley settled into its new form, not the silence of absence, but the silence of everything held under weight, waiting for the weight to lift. "The spring on the north face," Douglas said finally. "Silas Calloway told me about it in 1852. He'd sheltered in this cave during a hunting storm, said the spring never froze, said the rock held heat like nothing he'd seen. His eyes moved to the wall where the limestone carried its patient warmth. When I transferred the land to you, I told myself the property was worth something, that I wasn't giving you nothing. Harriet waited. I wasn't giving you enough. The admission arrived not as confession, but as arithmetic, the simple acknowledgement of a sum that did not balance. I knew that. I gave it anyway because it was convenient to know it and not say it. She picked up the field glass from the entrance shelf and set it in her coat pocket. She walked to the interior chamber and brought out the tin box she kept under the sleeping platform, her tin box with the Chillicothe references inside the things she had carried because she could not leave them. She set it on the limestone shelf without opening it. The flue liner, she said again. Small fire first. He looked at the tin box. He looked at her. For the first time in 6 months, Douglas Vance did not appear to know what the correct arrangement was. She turned back to the entrance and looked at the stopped sky. Below, the white valley lay under its silence. The storm had taken everything it could reach and had reached everything it could. The farmhouse stood in the white field chimney, dark, waiting. The cave held its heat behind her, steady as it had been in September and October, in the long accumulating cold of the months between. She had not come down the hill for him. She had come down the hill because the mathematics of the situation required it, because she was the only person within reach who possessed what the situation required. That it happened to be Douglas Vance inside the cold house was incidental to the decision in the way that the identity of a drowning person is incidental to the decision of a person who knows how to swim. But it was not incidental to what came after. What came after was a different kind of arithmetic, and she understood standing in the stopped silence of the post-storm entrance that it had already begun its long calculation. She went inside to build the fire. The roads cleared by degrees the way things clear in February, not all at once but in sections. The southern exposures, first the low roads before the high ones, the traveled paths before the forgotten ones. By the third week of the month, wagon traffic had returned to the valley floor, leaving twin ruts in the softening mud that would harden again at night into ridges and soften again by midday. The world was in the process of deciding whether winter was finished with it, a decision it would revise several times before spring made the matter settled. Douglas returned to the farmhouse on the 5th day after the storm, once the drift against the south door had been cleared enough to make the entrance passable. He walked down the hill without ceremony, Cecilia beside him, both of them carrying what they had brought up. Harriet watched them go from the cave entrance. She did not call after them. There was nothing to call. The farmhouse chimney began producing smoke that afternoon. Thin at first, the tentative smoke of a fire being tested in a flue that had been cold for nearly a week. Then thicker, more confident, the smoke of a hearth that had remembered its purpose. She watched it through the field glass and felt the particular satisfaction of a problem resolved, which was not the same as feeling glad about anything that had led to the problem. What happened next in the valley happened the way water moves through limestone, not in a single dramatic rush, but through accumulated pressure finding its channels. The story of the storm spread not because anyone told it deliberately, but because the evidence of it was visible. The Vance farmhouse had been unoccupied for 5 days, at the height of the worst storm in 30 years. The farmhouse chimney had gone cold. Douglas Vance had come down from the hillside cave rather than from his own porch. In a valley of 300 people where everyone's movements were common knowledge within a day, this sequence of facts required no narrator. Robert Calloway came first. He arrived on a Thursday morning in the last week of February, a load of split oak on one shoulder, his hat in his other hand. He walked up the hill without stopping and set the wood against the cave wall in the alcove with the practiced placement of a man who understood how to stack wood in a shelter. He did not make a speech. He stood in the entrance and looked at the interior the way men look at construction they respect, but did not expect to respect. I should have come sooner. His voice was direct, unembellished, the voice of someone who had decided to say the thing without surrounding it with anything softer. Harriet looked at him. You're here now. He stepped inside. He stood in the warmth for a moment, his face changing slightly as the temperature registered not surprise exactly, but the recalibration of a person whose prior model of a place has been replaced by the actual place. He ran one hand along the log frame of the interior wall, checking the joinery the way a carpenter checks another carpenter's work. He said nothing further. He left. Others came through that week not in any organized way, but in the uncoordinated fashion of people arriving at the same conclusion through separate paths. A sack of dried apples appeared outside the entrance one morning. A woman Harriet knew slightly. Martha Webb, wife of the elderly Harmon Webb, climbed the slope one afternoon with a jar of preserved peaches wrapped in cloth. She handed it over without entering, as though the threshold required a different kind of permission than she was prepared to extend. Harmon said the spring on the north face runs all winter. She offered the information, serving as both acknowledgement of what Harriet had done and evidence that the valley had been watching more closely than it had let on. None of them called it repayment. The word would have required an admission about what had been owed, which would have required an admission about what had been done, which was a distance most of them were not yet prepared to travel. They placed what they brought and moved on, and the cumulative weight of those small offerings was its own kind of statement, more legible than any apology, precisely because it required action rather than words. Nora Pruitt took longer. She arrived on the third day of March alone, climbing the slope with the deliberate pace of a woman who had decided to make this particular trip and was not going to be hurried through it. The snow was mostly gone by then. Patches remained in the north-facing hollows, the last holdouts of a winter that had been decisive. The hill showed the first suggestion of green in the grass that had survived under the snowpack, pale tentative. She stood in the cave entrance for longer than necessary. Her eyes moved across the interior, the wall, the shelves, the sleeping platform, the limestone ceiling, and the slow circuit of someone taking a true inventory rather than a confirming glance. She stepped inside. She turned once, a full, slow rotation, her gaze traveling up to the rock overhead, where the limestone caught the light from the entrance, in a way that made its age visible, its patience. Her face showed nothing at first. Then it showed something she was working to contain. "It's steady in here," she said. Her voice was not the precise declarative voice she had used in October. Something had come out of it. "Yes." Nora reached up and removed her glove. She pressed her bare palm against the south wall, held it there. Her jaw moved slightly. She removed her hand, looked at it, returned it to the wall. The gesture was not theatrical. It was the gesture of a person using their body to verify something their mind had already told them. "I misjudged this place." She took a breath. "I misjudged you." The words came out with the stiffness of joints long unused, but they came out whole. She had not abbreviated them into something more comfortable. Harriet waited. Nora's hand came down from the wall. Her eyes moved to the entrance to the valley below. "When the chimney went cold, Douglas would not have walked to my house. He would have sat in that room until sitting was no longer possible." She paused. "You knew that." "I knew it was possible. You went down that hill anyway." Her eyes returned to Harriet's face, direct without the evaluative overlay they had carried in October. "You didn't have to." "No." Nora looked at her for a long moment, looked in the way that means seeing rather than assessing. She nodded once, a small movement, the kind that closes a long internal argument. She walked to the entrance, stepped out into the March light, descended the slope without looking back. Harriet stood in the warmth of the cave after Nora had gone, and noticed not for the first time that the most significant conversions are always the quiet ones. The loud ones are for audiences. The quiet ones are for the person making them. Douglas came alone on a morning in early March, the sky pale with the uncertainty of a month that had not yet committed itself. He had no hat. He stood in the alcove outside the entrance, not inside, not fully outside, occupying the threshold, and watched Harriet split wood with the hatchet she had used every morning since October. She did not stop. "When I transferred the property to you," he began, his voice carrying the quality of something said to the hillside as much as to her, "I told myself it was something. I told myself the spring was worth having, that a person who knew how to use the land could make something of it." He stopped. The valley was quiet below them, the field soft with the beginning of mud season. "I was constructing a story that let me do what was convenient. I knew the cave had value. I knew you didn't know it yet." She set down a new piece of oak, positioned it on the splitting stump. "I didn't think you would stay long enough to learn it." The admission arrived without decoration. "I was wrong in that. I was wrong about what I gave you, and I was wrong about why I gave it, and I was wrong about what you were." She brought the hatchet down, a clean split. She set the hatchet in the stump and turned to look at him. He held her gaze, which he had not done in the lawyer's office in August, which he had not done on the hillside in September, which he was doing now with the steadiness of a man who has decided that the easier option has been foreclosed. "I see you," he said, The sentence was plain, unadorned, carrying the weight of everything it replaced. It was not grand. It was not the language of formal restitution. It was the language of one person acknowledging another person's reality after a period of refusing to, and in its plainness, it was more complete than any elaborate apology would have been. Harriet held his gaze for a moment. Then she reached into her coat and withdrew the original land document, the one from the lawyer's office in August. Creased now from months of being carried, the paper softened at the folds. She had never stopped carrying it. She set it on the flat surface of the splitting stump between them. Douglas looked at it. He reached into his own coat and produced a second document, newer, the paper still crisp. He placed it beside hers. She unfolded the new document. It was a deed of full legal ownership, not a transfer of use, not a revocable assignment, but title signed, dated the 28th of December, 1882. 2 weeks before the storm. The lawyer's seal was on it, the signatures complete. He had prepared this in the final days of December, at the point when his own conscience had finally outrun the story he had been telling himself. And the roads had closed before he could deliver it. A small storm in early January had made the hill path impassable for 2 weeks. Then the great storm had made everything impassable for longer still. The roads were closed, he said simply. I couldn't get it to you. She folded the deed and held it in both hands, looking at him. He looked back and neither of them spoke, because there was a specific kind of moment that speaking moves through and past too quickly, and this was that kind of moment. He left without additional ceremony, walking down the hill, with his hands in his coat pockets, his hat still absent, the March wind moving through his gray hair. The boy came 2 days later. She was working at the exterior hearth, adjusting the placement of the hearthstones, a task she had been meaning to address since January, a small realignment that would improve the heat direction by perhaps 15 degrees. She heard the footsteps on the path before she saw him light, careful, the footsteps of someone who has taught himself to move quietly on a hillside. He appeared around the last hemlock tree and stopped when he saw her looking at him. He was 16, tall for his age, with the unfinished quality of a body that had recently made several decisions about its final form, but had not yet completed them. His hat was in his hands. He had his father's coloring. Robert Calloway's broad forehead, Robert Calloway's direct eyes, but the expression he wore was entirely his own. The expression of someone who has rehearsed something and is now in the moment of delivering it, finding that the rehearsal was insufficient preparation for the actuality. I brought the wood, he said. The plural implied both times, October, November, without requiring him to specify. Both times. His chest moved with a breath he was organizing. My father doesn't know. She waited. I saw you building the wall in October. He turned his hat slowly in his hands. I watched from the tree line a few times. Not to... He stopped, reconsidered. I wanted to see if you knew what you were doing. A pause. You didn't at first. Then you did. Harriet said nothing. This was the kind of statement that required nothing from her except the attention she was already giving it. When the ice storm came in November, I thought if you ran out of wood, you might leave. His hands stilled on the hat brim. I didn't think you should leave. He met her eyes with the directness of someone who has decided that the time for managed distance has passed. I thought you would stay. I thought you were the kind of person who stays. She looked at him for a moment. He held the look without flinching, the way young people hold things when they are being entirely sincere and have not yet learned to be embarrassed by sincerity. Your instinct was correct, she said. Something in him settled, not relaxed exactly, but resolved the way a structure settles when the final piece is placed. He put his hat on, adjusted the brim, looked at the hearthstone arrangement she had been adjusting. The left one needs to come forward about 2 inches, he said with the authority of someone who has thought about fire management. The draft is pulling heat up instead of in. She looked at the hearthstone. He was right. He moved the stone without being asked, the adjustment precise, and the fire's behavior changed immediately. The heat that had been escaping upward found the interior passage instead, and the temperature in the alcove climbed by several degrees within minutes. He stepped back and looked at the result with satisfaction. Your father taught you that, she asked. My grandfather. He put his hands in his pockets. He built 3 hearths, said the draft is everything. The fire is just what you feed it. He came twice more that month, once with his father, who arrived with a second load of wood, and spent an hour examining the cave's construction in the way a craftsman examines work. He wishes he had been asked to be part of. Once alone with a small paper packet of vegetable seeds from his mother, who had sent no message but whose handwriting on the packet label, neat, careful, communicated a distinct point of view about the situation. Cecilia came on a Sunday afternoon in the third week of March, when the light had acquired its first real warmth of the year, not just illumination, but temperature. The sun finally producing the heat it had been promising since February. She brought bread, a full loaf still warm, wrapped in a cloth. She stood beside Harriet at the cave entrance, and they watched the light move down the far ridge in the long, slow traverse of a late afternoon. "I lay awake the second night here," Cecilia said. Her voice was quiet in the register of things said to the middle distance, rather than to a specific person. "I listened to the rock hold its temperature in the dark. I had never known a place to feel like that." She paused. Like something that had decided to be reliable, and had been reliable for so long it didn't need to announce it anymore. Harriet said nothing. "I spent months hoping you would leave." Cecilia's hands were folded in front of her coat, less like armor now, more like the habit of a woman thinking carefully. "I didn't want to learn you. I thought if I knew you better, the thing we had done would become heavier. I thought not knowing you kept it light." The light continued its slow movement down the ridge. A crow crossed the sky above the valley unhurried. "It didn't." Cecilia's voice was lower now. "It didn't stay light. It got heavier anyway, and I didn't have you to put it beside." She unfolded her hands. "I was wrong about all of it, about the land, about what we owed you, about who you were." The word wrong came out with a slight tremor in it, not from weakness, but from the specific difficulty of saying a true thing you have been avoiding for a long time. "I have been wrong about this since August." Harriet reached forward and adjusted the kettle hook over the exterior fire, moving it 2 inches to better center the pot. "Winter has a way of correcting people," she said. Cecilia let out a breath, a long, weighted exhalation, the breath of someone setting something down. They stood together in the cooling afternoon until the light left the far ridge entirely. The invitation came the following week: dinner at the farmhouse, a Sunday, written in Cecilia's handwriting on a card left at the cave entrance. The formality of the card, its smallness, its care, the 2 lines written without erasure, communicated that this was not a casual suggestion. Harriet arrived at the farmhouse at 6 in the evening, when the last light was still on the ridgeline. The door opened before she reached the porch. Cecilia stepped aside without speaking, her face carrying the open expression of someone who has stopped preparing it. Douglas stood near the hearth, the working hearth, the fire lit, and pulling correctly, no trace of the cold week remaining, except in the way he stood beside it, with the particular appreciation of a man who no longer takes a maintained fire for granted. He was not stiff. He was not performing ease. He was simply there in the room, waiting without managing it. The table had 3 places set, each given equal position. Not 2 places with a third added as concession. 3 places the cloth laid to include all 3 from the beginning. They sat. Cecilia served the stew herself, ladled evenly. The bread was passed without formality, hand to hand. They ate mostly in silence, which was not the silence of discomfort, but the silence of people who have said the necessary things and are now in the space that comes after, where ordinary life begins again. At one point, Douglas turned to look at the window through which the hillside was just barely visible. In the last of the dusk, the hemlock tree line, the pale strip of the path, the dark mass of the hill above it. He looked for a moment without speaking. He did not need to speak. Whatever he was thinking was between him and the window. Harriet watched him look at the hill. She thought about the deed in her coat pocket, the one dated December 28th legal, and sealed the ownership complete. She thought about Cecilia's note, the one she had read twice, once in haste on Market Street in August, once by full daylight in January, when she had finally seen the second paragraph she had missed in the dark. That second paragraph had not changed anything structural. The deed was the deed regardless of what Cecilia had written. But it had changed her understanding of the woman across the table, had shown her someone who had been paying attention all along, who had known more than she had said, who had chosen to say what she could in the only form available to her at the time. She had not mentioned the second reading to either of them. Some things are better understood privately, kept in the interior chamber, where they inform everything without requiring display. The meal ended. Cecilia cleared the plates. Douglas poured 3 small measures of bourbon from a bottle that had clearly been brought out in anticipation of the evening. He placed one in front of each of them. He did not make a toast. He lifted his glass, looked at Harriet across the table, and drank. She lifted hers and drank. April came with its usual disruption of the narrative winter had established. The valley shook itself out of stillness. Mud season gave way to the first real green. The creeks ran high with snowmelt. The air smelled of turned earth from the farms beginning their spring work. The cave path, which had been a private road through most of winter, became visible from the lower road, now that the trees were not yet fully leafed, and people who passed below could see without effort. The smoke line from the exterior hearth, the stacked wood in the alcove, the figure of a woman going about the particular business of a day that had purpose. The valley had revised its narrative. Not dramatically, the revision was internal, mostly the kind that happens when people update their understanding of a situation without publicly acknowledging that they had previously gotten it wrong. But the quality of the looks that came up the hill had changed. Robert Calloway, passing on the lower road with his wagon, lifted his hat. Martha Webb at her garden fence raised her hand. Nora Pruitt, who Harriet saw on the road into town one Thursday morning in early April, stopped and spoke without any of the evaluation she had previously carried. They spoke about the spring mud, the state of the road, the likelihood of late frost. Normal conversation. The conversation of people who are acquainted. It was not transformation. It was adjustment. The slow correction of a community's sense of what was true, accomplished not through argument or accusation, but through the steady accumulation of evidence provided by a woman who had decided that the most effective response to being underestimated was to be excellent at a life they had predicted would fail. The deed was registered at the county courthouse on the 14th of April. Douglas and Harriet both present for the recording, the transaction quiet completed without ceremony. The clerk, a young man named Fletcher, who had not been present for any of the preceding 7 months, recorded the transfer with the efficient disinterest of a man for whom land transfers were the common substance of his days. He stamped the document, returned Harriet's copy, moved to the next item on his desk. She folded the deed and put it in her coat beside the original document from August beside Cecilia's note. She carried all three together. She was not certain why she had a tin box. She had a shelf she could store them in any number of places that were more practical than an interior coat pocket. She kept them together against her sternum because they were the three documents that told the story of 1 year in its actual shape, unedited, and she was not ready to put the story in a box yet. Perhaps she never would be. On an evening in late April, Harriet climbed back to the cave at dusk after a day in town provisions. The courthouse for the deed confirmation, a brief conversation with Robert Calloway about whether the road above the second bend would hold through the rest of mud season. The light was that specific late April light that arrives before leaves have fully opened, when the bare branches filter the sky into something fine and complex, the ridgeline visible in detail that summer will obscure. She came through the hemlock trees onto the limestone shelf and stopped at the cave entrance. The valley was below her in its entirety, the farms, the lower road, the creek catching the last light, the Vance farmhouse with its chimney producing its steady evening smoke. The sound of the valley rose to her, a dog somewhere, the distant iron note of a farrier's hammer at the smithy. Ordinary sounds, the sounds of a place going about its life. She pressed her palm against the limestone wall. The rock was warm, not dramatically, not warmly enough to surprise anyone discovering it for the first time this late in April, when the days had begun to accumulate their own heat. But it was warm in the specific way that had stopped her from leaving in November, warm in the way that had made everything else possible, the stored warmth of all the days it had been given heat and had kept it patient and non-declarative, available when called upon. She thought about the year and its shape, not the dramatic outline of it, the storm, the rescue, the conversations, but its texture. The 11 days it had taken to build the first wall, the 3 weeks the heating problem had taken to solve, the morning in November when she had threaded 4 eyelets of her boot and stopped, the specific quality of the warmth that had stopped her. None of those moments had announced themselves as significant. They had presented themselves as ordinary problems requiring ordinary attention, and it was only in the aggregate that they had become the shape of something she had made. This was the thing she had tried to explain to Cecilia and Nora, and even to Douglas, in the way that things are explained without being said, that what looked from the valley like stubbornness or endurance, or the particular recklessness of a woman with nothing left to lose, had been from the inside simply the practice of attention. The practice of looking long enough at each problem to find the feature of it that was actually useful. The spring that didn't freeze. The thermal mass of limestone. The angle of the wind off the northeast. The difference between green wood and oak. The sound that rock makes when a mattock handle finds it under 8 feet of snow. She had not survived the winter through strength. She had survived it through the accumulated interest on a series of small observations, each one building on the last. Each one possible only because she had stayed long enough to make the next one. The light was going now, the far ridge darkening from gold to brown to the first suggestion of blue. Below, the farmhouse lamp came on in the kitchen window, the warm yellow square of it visible in the dusk. She watched it for a moment, not with sentiment, not with the complicated weight of everything that had happened between that house and this hill. With something cleaner, the recognition of a light maintained by people who had learned at cost to maintain what they had. She lowered her hand from the wall. She went inside. The fire caught at the third attempt. The wood had been sitting in the cooling air all day and needed encouragement. She fed it carefully. Small pieces first built the temperature in patient stages. The limestone absorbed what the fire produced, receiving it steadily, beginning the slow accumulation that would release through the night in the direction of the cold, which was everything outside her four walls. She sat on the sleeping platform with the three documents in her lap: the August transfer, Cecilia's note, the April deed. She did not read them. She knew what they said. She held them for a moment in the warming interior, feeling their combined weight, which was not heavy, which was the weight of paper, which was the weight of a year set down in writing by three different hands, each one saying a different thing about the same woman at the same hillside from different distances. She put them in the tin box. She put the tin box on the second limestone shelf. Outside, the valley made its nighttime sounds. The fire settled into its rhythm. The rock walls did what they had done every night since October. They received the heat the fire produced, held it in the crystalline architecture of their composition, and would return it through the small hours at the rate that physics determined. Steady, uncommanded, without any requirement that anyone acknowledge the process or thank it for its work. The hill did not know it had kept her alive. It had simply been what it was, dense, patient, indifferent in the way that useful things are indifferent. And she had learned to work with what it was rather than against it, and that had been the whole of it. She lay down on the warm stone floor in the ordinary dark of an April night. The warmth held around her. The valley was quiet. She had not come here by choice. She had come here by the mechanism of a world that had arranged itself in the pattern of her diminishment, and she had found in the place of her diminishment the elements of something she could not have designed if she had tried. You cannot design limestone. You cannot design a spring that does not freeze. You cannot design the capacity of a dense material to retain heat through a January night. You find them, or you are given them in the form of something that was intended as nothing, and then it is a question of what you do with the finding. She had done what she knew how to do. She had paid attention long enough to understand what she had been given. The rest had followed from that, the way things follow when the first fact is correctly understood. The fire burned. The rock held. Outside, the first real night of spring settled over a valley that had stopped waiting for her to fail.